I didn't come to the Graywood Ranch looking for anything but quiet. My life in the city had been a symphony of noise, a constant, grinding hum of traffic and voices and expectations I could never quite meet. So I traded it all for the rustle of aspens, the lowing of cattle, and the vast, crushing silence of the Montana sky. I took a job keeping the books, a simple, solitary task that let me live in a small cabin set away from the main house, a hermit in a kingdom of cowboys. And then there was Cole. He wasn't part of the quiet I had bargained for. He was the ranch foreman, a man who seemed carved from the very rock and timber of the landscape. From my window, I watched him. It became my primary occupation, more consuming than balancing ledgers or tracking feed costs. He moved with a physical certainty that I, a man made of paper and ink and hesitation, found both terrifying and magnetic. He was a force of nature. The sun seemed to catch in the dusty blonde of his hair. His shoulders were a solid line against the horizon, and his voice, when I heard it carrying on the wind, was a low rumble of command that made the horses prick their ears and the other hands move a little faster. He was, from my safe distance, a figure of myth. Unattainable, probably cruel. He never spoke to me beyond a clipped nod in passing. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, would sweep over me and find nothing of interest, nothing to hold their gaze. I was just a numbers guy, the pale, quiet man who lived in the bookkeeper's cabin. An afterthought. This distance was a chasm I had no intention of crossing. It was safe. My longing for him was a secret, a quiet ache I nursed in the solitude of my cabin, as harmless as admiring a distant, beautiful mountain range you know you'll never climb. A beautiful, painful thing to be observed, not touched. My routine was my armor. Wake at dawn, coffee, work on the books, a quiet lunch, more work, then a walk as the sun bled across the western plains. It was a life of perfect, predictable loneliness, and I thought it was what I wanted, until the sky turned the color of a bruise. The forecast had mentioned a storm, but forecasts in this part of the country were more suggestion than science. This was different. The air grew heavy, thick with a strange, electric stillness. The horses in the far pasture grew restless, their tails twitching, their heads high and scenting the air. I was out checking on a new foal, a skittish little thing named Willow, when the first flakes began to fall. They weren't gentle. They were hard, dense pellets of ice, driven by a wind that appeared out of nowhere, screaming down from the mountains. Within minutes, the world was gone, swallowed by a swirling vortex of white. My cabin, only a few hundred yards away, might as well have been on another continent. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my jacket. My only thought was the barn. The main barn was a massive structure, a wooden fortress against the elements. I grabbed Willow's lead, my fingers already numb, and leaned into the wind, letting the vague, dark shape of the barn guide me. The wind howled, a physical presence that shoved and tore at me. By the time I wrestled the small barn door open and pulled the terrified foal inside, I was shaking, my lungs burning with frigid air. The relative quiet inside was a balm. The air was warm, thick with the familiar, comforting smells of hay and horse and leather. And in the main door groaned shut, a heavy, final sound that sealed us in. I turned, and my heart stopped. Cole stood there, shaking snow from his hat. He was not a myth seen from a window. He was real, and he was close, and we were trapped. The storm that had erased the world outside had just created a new one, a very small one, inside this barn. And it contained only him, and me. For a long moment, he didn't seem to see me. His focus was entirely on the task at hand, his movements efficient and sure as he secured the heavy crossbar over the main doors. The sound of the bar sliding into its iron brackets was a death knell for my composure. My solitude, my carefully constructed distance. Gone. He turned, and his eyes finally landed on me, huddled by the foal's stall. There was a flicker of surprise, nothing more. "Leo," he said. My name in his mouth was an unfamiliar sound. Rough. I was checking on the foal. I managed, my voice thin against the roar of the wind outside. "Good," he grunted, already moving past me, his gaze sweeping the interior of the barn, assessing, cataloging. "Get her settled." "We're not going anywhere for a while. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Hours, maybe the whole night. My stomach filled with a frantic swarm of bees. I fumbled with the latch on Willow's stall, my fingers clumsy and stupid. I could feel his presence behind me, a weight in the air, a source of heat. I watched him work, my observations no longer safe and distant. They were immediate, sensory, overwhelming. Up close, I saw the things my window had hidden. A pale, thin scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a ghost of some past violence. The deep, sun-etched lines around his eyes, telling a story of squinting into 1,000 sunrises. His hands. My God, his hands. They weren't just strong. They were maps of a life I couldn't comprehend. Calloused and scarred, the knuckles thick, but they were impossibly gentle as he checked the water troughs. His movements economical and calm, reassuring the restless animals with his steady presence. He worked with a silent competence that was mesmerizing. He didn't waste a single motion. Every step had a purpose. I, on the other hand, felt like a collection of awkward, useless limbs. I finished with the full and stood there, unsure of my place in this small, temporary world. He seemed to forget I existed for a while, lost in the rhythm of his work. Then he stopped by the main generator, a hulking diesel beast in the corner that powered the barn's lights and heaters. He flipped a switch. Nothing. He tried again. A tired cough, then silence. A curse slipped from his lips, low and frustrated. It was the first crack I had ever seen in his perfect, unassailable confidence. He kicked the machine's metal casing, a gesture of pure, impotent rage. And in that moment, he wasn't the myth from my window. He was just a man. A cold, tired man, frustrated and stuck. The fuel line might be clogged, I heard myself say. The words were out before I could stop them. He turned to look at me, his expression a mixture of annoyance and surprise. What would you know about it? His tone was sharp, dismissive. The old fear, the familiar feeling of being small and inadequate, washed over me. I should have kept my mouth shut. But something else, something I didn't recognize, pushed back. My father restored old tractors, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. They had engines like this. It's usually the sediment filter in the line. He stared at me, his stormy eyes narrowed in suspicion or maybe consideration. The silence stretched, filled only by the scream of the wind. "Show me," he said finally. The words were a command, but they felt like an invitation. The power dynamic, the one that had always felt like a cliff face between us, suddenly shifted. Here, in this one small area, I had knowledge he didn't. The ground, for the first time, felt level. I knelt by the machine, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He knelt beside me, so close. I could smell the cold air on his coat, the faint scent of leather, and something else, something uniquely him. Warm and masculine. "Need a wrench," I mumbled, trying to focus on the engine, on the familiar feel of grease and metal, on anything but the solid presence of his thigh pressed against mine. He reached for the nearby toolbox without a word. He handed me the tool, and it happened. The first touch. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed against mine as I took the wrench. It wasn't a lingering touch. It was an accident, a fleeting, meaningless collision of skin. But for me, it was a lightning strike. A jolt of pure, unadulterated heat shot up my arm, straight to my chest, where it exploded. My breath hitched. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. My skin tingled where he had touched it, branded. I'm sure he felt nothing. A passing spark of static electricity at most. But I felt everything. A decade of silent, distant observation, of secret longing, of hopeless daydreams, all condensed into that one shocking, infinitesimal moment. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. The wrench clattered on the concrete floor. My face flushed with heat, a humiliating wave of shame and panic. He knows. The thought screamed through my mind. He felt that. He knows what you are, what you want. I didn't dare look at him. I stared at the generator, my eyes fixated on a meaningless bolt, praying he would say nothing, praying the ground would open up and swallow me whole. "You all right?" he asked. His voice was low, and for the first time, it held a note of something other than command or indifference. Concern. It was worse than anger. It was disarming. Fine, I croaked, fumbling for the wrench. Just cold a lie. I was on fire. He didn't press. He just watched me, his silence more unnerving than any question. I forced my shaking hands to work, to find a fuel line, to unscrew the filter housing. My mind was a blur of panic and sensation, replaying the touch over and over again. The rough texture of his skin, the surprising warmth, the solid reality of him. Finally, I managed to get the filter out. It was thick with gunk, just as I'd suspected. I cleaned it as best I could with a rag he provided, my movements jerky and inefficient. When I was done, I put it back together, my hand still not quite my own. "Try now," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I stood up, putting a necessary distance between us, and watched as he primed the engine and flipped the switch. The generator sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. The overhead lights flickered on, flooding the barn with a harsh, steady yellow glow. A small electric heater in the corner began to hum, promising warmth. Cole straightened up and turned to me. The harsh light carved his face into sharp angles and shadows. He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. "Thanks," he said. 2 syllables, but they felt like a peace treaty, an acknowledgement. We retreated to the small, cluttered tack room, huddling near the electric heater. The space was tiny, barely big enough for 2 people, smelling strongly of saddle soap and old leather. The storm raged outside, a wild, chaotic beast, but in here there was a strange, tense pocket of quiet. We sat on opposite benches, the heater glowing between us. The silence was a physical weight. I was hyper-aware of everything. The way he rested his forearms on his knees. The slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. The way the light caught the scar on his eyebrow. I expected him to retreat into his usual stony silence, to rebuild the wall between us. But he didn't. He spoke. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the floor between his boots. My heart hammered against my ribs. "What did you expect?" I asked, my own voice hushed. He shrugged, a slow movement of his broad shoulders. "Just another city guy. Soft. Someone who'd run at the first sign of real work." He finally looked up, his gaze meeting mine across the small space. Someone who wouldn't know his way around a diesel engine. There was a hint of smile at the corner of his mouth. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines. It was like seeing the sun break through storm clouds. "I have hidden talents," I said, a flicker of my old, sarcastic self returning. "Guess so," he said, and the smile widened slightly. We fell silent again, but it was different this time. The tension had eased, replaced by a fragile, tentative curiosity. "Why did you come out here, Leo?" he asked, his tone genuine. "To Graywood." The question was simple, but the answer was not. "I needed the quiet," I said, which was the truth but not the whole truth. Running from something? His perception was unnervingly sharp. I hesitated. No one had ever asked. No one had ever cared enough to. Myself, mostly, I admitted, the words tasting strange and foreign. A life that didn't fit. A person I didn't want to be anymore. He nodded slowly, his eyes holding mine. He understood. I could see it in his gaze. He understood what it was to feel like you didn't belong. "I get that," he said softly. And then, the confession. Not from me. From him. "I thought you hated it here," he said, looking away again, back at the floor. "I thought you hated me." The words hit me like a physical blow. Hated him? The irony was so bitter, so vast, it almost made me laugh. If he only knew. If he only knew that every clipped nod, every dismissive glance, was a treasure I hoarded and analyzed for hours. "I've never hated you, Cole," I said, and the honesty of it made my voice shake. I was intimidated. He looked back at me, genuinely confused. "By me? I struggled for the right word, a word that wouldn't betray the obsessive depth of my feelings. "You belong here. You're a part of this place. I'm just visiting." "No, you're not," he said, his voice firm. "You've been here a year. You're not visiting." He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between us. The air grew thick. I see you, he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur that vibrated through the tiny room. In your window, watching the blood drain from my face. Caught, exposed. My secret, my pathetic, silent obsession, was not a secret at all. He had known all along. Shame washed over me, hot and suffocating. I wanted to disappear, to become part of the shadows in the corner. I'm sorry, I whispered, my eyes fixed on my own hands, clenched into white-knuckled fists in my lap. Don't be, he said. 2 words. They stopped my spiraling thoughts cold. I risked a glance at him. He had moved. He was off his bench, kneeling on the floor in front of me. He was so close, his body heat a tangible presence. He reached out, slowly, telegraphing the motion, giving me time to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. His calloused fingers gently touched my chin, tilting my head up so I had to meet his eyes. His thumb brushed against my lower lip. It was not an accident this time. It was deliberate, questioning. My heart felt like a frantic, trapped bird, beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. This is happening. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. This is real. His eyes, those stormy seas, were filled with a raw, unguarded vulnerability I had never seen before. The confidence, the arrogance, it was all gone. In its place was a mirror of my own longing, my own fear. He leaned in, his gaze dropping from my eyes to my mouth. The world outside, the howling storm, the barn, the horses, it all faded away. There was only this, the space between our lips, charged with a year of unspoken words and stolen glances. And then he closed that space. The kiss was not what I had imagined in my lonely fantasies. It wasn't hard or demanding. It was slow, hesitant. It was a question. His lips were chapped from the wind, but they were soft, and they moved against mine with a searching, desperate honesty. I responded without thinking, my body acting on a need so deep and so long denied that it was pure instinct. My hands came up to cup his face, my fingers tangling in the short, rough hair at the nape of his neck. I felt a shudder go through him, a deep, visceral reaction. He made a sound, a low groan deep in his chest, and the kiss deepened. It was everything. It was the quiet acknowledgement of 1,000 mornings watching him from my window. It was the violent shock of our hands brushing. It was the shared vulnerability in the face of a storm. It was relief, a profound, soul-deep relief that I was not alone in this feeling. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His hand on my knees, his grip tight, anchoring. Leo, he breathed, my name a prayer. I couldn't speak. I could only feel. The beat of his heart against my chest, the warmth of his skin, the scent of him filling my senses. We stayed like that for a long time, sheltered in our small, warm bubble while the world raged outside. The storm, both inside and out, had finally broken. I woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight on my face. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. The smell of hay and leather brought it all rushing back. The barn, the storm, Cole. I had fallen asleep on one of the benches in the tack room, a coarse horse blanket draped over me. And I was alone. The silence was absolute. The wind had died. The generator was off. The only sound was the frantic, panicked thudding of my own heart. I sat up, the blanket pooling in my lap. He was gone. A cold dread, far more chilling than the storm had been, seeped into my bones. I stumbled out of the tack room into the main barn. The massive doors were open, and brilliant, pristine snow reflected the morning sun, bathing the space in a light so bright it hurt my eyes. The world was back, and he had left. There was no note, no sign he had ever been there, except for the blanket and the lingering warmth of the heater. My mind, my worst enemy, began its vicious work. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness brought on by the storm and the close quarters. He regrets it. He's disgusted. By you. By himself. The thoughts were a venomous spiral, pulling me down into a familiar abyss of self-recrimination and doubt. The intimacy, the vulnerability, the earth-shattering honesty of that kiss. It felt like a dream now. A beautiful, impossible dream that the harsh morning light had exposed as a fraud. I walked out of the barn, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. The world was clean and white and painfully silent. I saw him, far across the property, a dark figure against the snow, checking a fence line. He didn't look back. He was all business, the strong, silent foreman once again. The man from my window, as if last night had never happened. The chasm between us, the one we had bridged for a few stolen hours, was back, wider and deeper than ever before. And this time, the fall would be fatal. I retreated to my cabin, the solitude I had once craved, now a form of torture. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was empty. It was an absence. It was the shape of coal not being there. The entire day passed in a blur of anxious misery. I tried to work on the ledgers, but the numbers swam before my eyes, meaningless squiggles on a page. Every crunch of snow outside my window made my head snap up, my heart leaping with a pathetic, desperate hope. But it was never him, just the wind shaking snow from the pines. I replayed every moment from the barn, the way he'd looked at me, the sound of his voice, the feel of his lips. Had I imagined it all? Had I misread everything, projecting my own desperate longing onto a simple moment of shared hardship? The thought was humiliating. By the time dusk began to paint the snow in shades of lavender and rose, I had convinced myself it was over. I had been a fool. I had mistaken a moment of proximity for a moment of connection. He would go back to ignoring me. Only now it would be laced with a new, awkward pity. The thought was unbearable. Maybe I should just leave, pack my things, and disappear before I had to face him again. Run back to the city, back to the noise. At least the noise could drown out the sound of my own breaking heart. I was staring out the window at the darkening landscape, lost in my bleak thoughts, when a knock sounded on my cabin door. It was so sharp, so sudden it made me jump. My heart seized in my chest. It couldn't be. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Another knock, firmer this time. Hesitantly, my legs feeling like lead, I moved to the door. I opened a crack, and there he was, Cole. He stood on my small porch, backlit by the single yellow bulb, his shoulders dusted with fresh snowflakes. He looked exhausted. His face was drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. And he looked uncertain. The formidable foreman was gone. In his place was the man from the tack room. The vulnerable man who had confessed his own loneliness. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the worn wooden planks of the porch. He held something in his hand. A book. My book. A collection of poetry I'd left in the tack room. "You forgot this," he said, his voice low and rough. He held it out to me. It was an excuse. A flimsy, transparent excuse to be standing on my doorstep. And it was the most hopeful thing that had ever happened to me. I took the book, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The jolt was still there, just as powerful. Neither of us moved. He stood on the porch. I stood in the doorway, the cold night air rushing between us. "Can I come in?" he asked, finally lifting his head to meet my eyes. His gaze was pleading. All the fight, all the bravado was gone. I stepped back without a word, holding the door open. He walked inside, bringing the cold and the scent of pine with him. My cabin, which had always felt like my own small, contained world, suddenly felt impossibly small with him in it. He filled the space. He stood in the middle of the room, looking awkward and out of place, his large frame seeming to dwarf my modest furniture. I closed the door, shutting out the night. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "About this morning. About just leaving." I leaned against the door, my legs too weak to hold me. "I thought you regretted it," I said, the confession a painful whisper. "No," he said, shaking his head vehemently. "God, no. I didn't regret it." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. I panicked. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate need to make me understand. "Leo, I don't do that. I don't feel that. For anyone." He gestured vaguely, helplessly. The sun came up, and everything was normal again, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. So I ran. Like a coward, the relief that flooded through me was so immense it almost brought me to my knees. He wasn't disgusted. He was scared, just like me. I was scared too, I admitted. I spent the whole day thinking I had imagined it all. You didn't imagine it, he said, taking a step towards me. I've spent the whole day trying to forget it, trying to pretend it was just the storm. But it wasn't. He stopped just in front of me, so close I could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. It was you, he whispered. And that was it. That was all the reassurance I needed. The fear, the doubt, the day of agonizing uncertainty, it all dissolved in the face of his raw, terrifying honesty. I reached out and took his hand. His larger, rougher hand closed around mine, his grip firm and sure. This time I didn't pull away. The foreman's house is too big, he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It's too damn quiet. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And an invitation. It was the clumsy, heartfelt offering of a man who didn't have the words for what he was feeling. It was a key. A promise. My cabin is too small, I said, my voice steady, my gaze locked with his. It's been too quiet for a long time. A slow smile spread across his face. The real one. The one that reached his eyes and made the sun break through the clouds. He didn't leave that night. He never really left again. The transition was slow and unspoken. It started with him staying for dinner. Then he started leaving a spare jacket on the hook by my door. A toothbrush appeared in my bathroom. My small cabin began to absorb him, making space where there was none before. And then, one morning, after a week of this careful, hesitant dance, I woke up in his bed in the foreman's house. The morning after anxiety was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I woke to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and saw him standing by the window, a mug in his hand, looking out at the ranch. His ranch. Our ranch. He was wearing just a pair of jeans, his back and shoulders a landscape I was just beginning to learn how to navigate. He turned, as if sensing I was awake, and that soft smile touched his lips. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He brought a mug over to me. Our fingers brushed as I took it. The spark was still there. But now it wasn't a shock. It was a gentle, familiar warmth. A reminder. Our days found a new rhythm. I'd still do the books. He'd still run the ranch. But now, I didn't watch him from a distance. I'd walk out to the paddock with him in the morning, our shoulders brushing, his hand finding mine as we talked about the day ahead. The other hands noticed, of course. There were looks, murmurs. But Cole carried himself with a new, quiet confidence that dared anyone to say a word. His hand would rest on the small of my back as we walked to the main house. He would kiss me on the porch of our cabin in full view of anyone who cared to look. He was staking a claim, not just on me, but on the truth of his own life. And I, the man who had run from everything, found myself standing my ground. I found my bravery in his. One evening, months later, we were sitting on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set. The sky was on fire, a brilliant explosion of orange and purple. A comfortable silence settled between us, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. I used to watch you, I confessed into the quiet. From my window, every single day. He turned to look at me, his arm draped around my shoulders. "I know," he said, a smile in his voice. "I told you. I saw you," he paused, then added, "Sometimes I'd ride by your cabin an extra time or two at the end of the day, just to see if the light was on, just to see your shadow move behind the curtain, my breath caught in my throat. All that time, all those months, I thought I was invisible." He was watching me back. We were two lonely men, observing each other from a distance, both too afraid to cross the space between us. All it took was a storm to tear down the walls we had built. I came here seeking solitude, a quiet place to hide from the world, to hide from myself. I built a life of careful, predictable routines designed to keep everyone and everything at a safe distance. I thought I was content in my isolation, but I wasn't. I was just waiting. I was waiting for a plot twist. I was waiting for a disruption. Cole was the storm I never saw coming. He wasn't a disruption to my life. He was the beginning of it. He didn't just close the barn door that night. He opened a door in me I thought was sealed forever. He showed me that the quiet I was searching for wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of peace. And I found it here, with him, in the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart beating next to mine.